Welcome to this Roundup. It seems that across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, in short referred to as NGIOA, once formidable competitors that had built their success on apparently impenetrable strategic positions are now coming under serious attack from relatively unknown entities and innovators that are employing revolutionary new strategies and innovation. As a result, today, regardless of whether you are an individual or an entity hoping to start a new venture, or looking to disrupt an established industry, or are looking to anticipate disruption and are trying to understand disruptive innovations, understanding disruptive strategy is becoming vital for everyone across NGIOA. It is important that we all understand why is disruption happening? How are the changing fundamentals of cyberspace, geospace, and space, in short referred to as CGS, shifting today's technology, management, governance, financial models, and systems? How can individuals and entities across NGIOA prepare for the coming tomorrow? To discuss disruptive strategy and innovation further, I am delighted to welcome Steve Pearson to this Roundup. Steve is the founder and head of strategy and innovation at Pearson Strategy Group. Welcome, Steve. We are honored to have you in this Roundup.
Hi, Jay Cherie. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful, Steve. So today, irrespective of industries, innovators and startups with almost no experience and no capital, no serious backing are able to collapse established corporation strategy before they can even begin to grasp what's happening. How can any incumbent as or established corporation or any entity across NGIA compete with today's startups' disruptive strategy and innovation?
To kind of precede the answer to that, the question I have for you is that I have observed numerous companies that are very small and startup all the way up through mid-sized companies where we typically play. And they all behave similarly in that risk is both boring and less exciting than dealing with the innovation, the newness of their idea. And so they're easily diverted from looking into the risk. And so I don't know if that's something you've observed or not, but that's something we see quite frequently. And so one of the things that we look at when we address the commonality of risk assessment and identification is looking out at what competition is doing, such as your market competition. If you're a restaurant, certainly you'd want to know about other restaurants in your area and other ones that you could glean from that may pose a risk to you. At the same time, there's innovation wrapped up into that, and certainly we can discuss that whenever you're ready.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you make a very interesting point that what are the risks that entities of all different sizes, irrespective of whether they are the startups or mid-sized companies or large corporation, what are they missing out, and what are the risks that they are not acknowledging, or probably they are not being aware of, that is putting them into such a difficult position and they are being disrupted? And the answer to that is, of course, one is the strategic risk, another is the competitive intelligence, where to look, what kind of intelligence they need to be aware about. We are living in a time where the disruptors or competitors are not just coming from within any industry. If you are working for energy industry or telecom industry or a financial industry or healthcare, the competitors are not just coming from within your industry. They are coming from outside your industry where you have even no idea, and there are no geographical boundaries now. So innovation that could be happening in some part in Europe or some part in Asia, that could very well, disrupt and compete with the competition or the entities that are over here in the United States. So anybody can get disrupted. Innovations are happening everywhere in the world, and the strategic risk, which the biggest concern is that the culture and mentality of the corporations have changed significantly. They are more focused on the tactical risk, what is impacting now, and how they can provide the shareholder with bigger return, and how can they satisfy them. So all the executives, they are so focused on today's risk, what is going to impact them today. They are not concerned about what is happening tomorrow or what is going to happen in the coming tomorrow. And that is where we see a lot of challenges. And that's why, understanding strategic intelligence, understanding competitive intelligence is so very important. And of course, what we are addressing today is disruptive strategy. That is also so very important to understand. While in this episode, we are going to focus only on disruptive strategy, the coming episodes, we are going to address the competitive intelligence, strategic intelligence, because these are all very, very important topics that everyone needs to understand. And our mentality from just focusing on today needs to change to, how to also focus on tomorrow. While we have to focus on today, how to also address the coming tomorrow. So I hope that answers your question, and that we all the your observations probably, also it comes to this analysis that this is where we are facing the biggest challenges. We, as in the corporations, the established corporations, and the corporations that think that they are very mature entities and that there will not be any disruption. That's where, we are facing challenges. So while over the and another big factor is that while over the years geospace was an economy based only on products and services, because of the cyberspace and the changing fundamentals in the cyberspace, now we have an evolution from a product service based economy that is rapidly transforming to outcome based economy. So from your observation, who do you think is controlling this shift, revolution, and the fundamental transformation?
Well, I think there's a number of factors at play, and I don't know that there's a single party that we could say is behind all this. But certainly two of the long-term trends that we've observed is that data is becoming valuable. Of course, many people realize that, but they don't necessarily realize that in the context of manufacturing, as we call it, a widget. If they come up with a great new hardware device or product for a consumer, they're often think on selling that as making their money, their profit, their factory work, and work over a long time. And that may be true, and it's certainly valuable to starting up a company, but they don't consider the aspect that the digital data that they're going to generate, such as simply subscribers to their newsletters, is valuable. And the other long-term trend that we've seen, and this has happened over the space of 40 to 50 years, is intellectual property. Again, it's a data, but it's an intellectual, a virtual asset. Is again a kind of a nebulous concept for most product developers and companies because they're thinking that's where they're going to make their money. And so both of those combining together, you've got a legal aspect and a data aspect that are driving a potential huge amount of profit. Of course, companies that are somewhat purely digital, such as Google, they make almost all of their money, if not all of their money, off virtual services. But if you look behind the company, one of the ways that they control that market is through the legal aspect of patents, trademarks, and other things that protect this digital holistic entity that they have developed, and they're controlling their market space very well. So those things together are providing a lot of long-term value, and I don't see those ceasing anytime in the near future. So I don't know that there's a specific entity that we could blame or assign responsibility for that. Certainly the rules and regulations from our government, U.S. government, are helping drive that. But I think it's part of it is a technological capability that has not existed in the past, such as the internet, social media. Those factors are helping drive this. And I think it's surprising a lot of people. One of the things that I bring out is that the value of intellectual property, if you look at a study done by Ocean Tomo over a number of years now, they looked at this back about 40 to 50 years ago. The value of intellectual property for the Standard & Poor's 500 very large companies, that value was only in the order of 14 or 15%. Now, if you look at it today, that number is now 87%. And so that's one of the reasons that when we walk in and help companies innovate, strategize, assess their risk, is that we consider that as part of their risk element, because if they're infringing on a trademark, a patent, now what seemed like a great innovation opportunity, perhaps a disruptive opportunity, has now become a risk if they proceed into someone else's intellectual property. And so certainly we want to provide a balance and awareness, some research behind who might control those elements to take a true opportunity and maintain it as much as an opportunity as we can going forward.
Of course, of course. Now, so from your assessment and based on the interactions that you have with the corporations, mid-sized or large corporations in United States or across our nation's boundaries, in some other nations also, how would you describe the state of disruption that you are seeing?
Well, the disruption certainly is becoming more international. One of the things that we've noticed is that when we look at intellectual property, which is an area we research a lot, to look at it from a technological, a market, and of course a legal aspect, just to name a few, you have to look at how these patents are coming about. And if you look at the origins of the patents, one of the long-term trends that we've seen is China is filing a preponderance of intellectual property in the patent area recently. And their system, it can't be analogized apples to apples. It's kind of an apples and oranges comparison. But if you look at the long-term trend, that just that one country has come up significantly in the ranks as far as international filings. So one of the things we do to mitigate the opportunities, the risk brought about by an opportunity that is to research worldwide intellectual property amongst all the other things that we would do to help provide innovation and risk guidance down the road. And certainly China isn't the only factor, but looking internationally is really important. Again, picking finally on the aspect of international patent filings, if you look at the United States is publishing about 25% of the patents and patent applications in the world. That means for us inside the United States, 75% of our risk of not getting intellectual property or perhaps having a lawsuit as we move our products overseas or sell them, whatever that is held outside of the borders of the United States. And so that's very important. 75%, I think, is a very large number that most people really wouldn't be able to get their arms around without hearing it.
Yes, yes, very true. No, intellectual property, the point that you just mentioned is very, very important. And every organization, every innovator, every startup, they need to be very aware of that, and especially the mid and large corporations also. But it seems that while there is a lot of intellectual property patent that are being filed, are all those patents driving towards a disruptive model for business that could probably disrupt an entire industry, or whether a significant portion of the industry? That is not necessarily true. So while there are a lot of patents being filed, I acknowledge that, I agree that most of them are just minor modifications of the way to do things differently, or the way to improve the quality slightly, or the way to change the business process in a small manner. But if you look at the overall disruption of all these patents files, you won't see that in most of the patents. So from your assessment, do you see the disruptors intellectual property or the patent that you are seeing that are disruptive? Do you actually see them building business models that are very different from the incumbents based on the patents that they are filing?
Well, there's no single answer. So certainly patents, many of them are incremental improvements, and many of the improvements that people think of outside of the patenting space are incremental improvements. And next, picking on restaurants, they may introduce a new food or a new decor in the restaurant, and those are all minor improvements that I would consider incremental. But when it comes to disruptive changes, it's interesting to me because in some social media discussions I've held with other people, many people disagree on what really disruptive is. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. But in my own context in the world, I think there has to be market disruption, a displacement of an existing market participant, a large one, or many of them. And so one of the things that I think that makes important is that, disruption is viewed differently by different people. But to me, this market participation is important. And so to relate that back to your question, John Cherie, is that patents are often filed and they're incremental, but amongst all the chafe, if you will, of all these patents being filed, a cloud, if you will, there are some nuggets of real importance in there that are disruptive. Whether they're ready for the marketplace is a completely separate question. So there's a balancing act with any source of data, including patents, to say, is that really ready or not? An example of that would be space travel, time travel type things. At some point, they're not allowed to be patented, but if you go through and look at the patents, you'll see things that you'll say, those are not ready to go anywhere. That's not going to happen. And so they're well ahead of the marketplace, well ahead of the value of patenting today. But nonetheless, somebody decided to drive a stake in the ground. Whether it's a small entrant or a large market participant, it just all depends.
Yes, yes. No, I hear your point on that, and it is rare that a technology or product or any innovation is inherently sustaining or disruptive. Now, when any new technology is developed, how do decision makers make a strategic choice between taking a sustaining path or taking a disruptive one based on your interaction with the decision makers here in the United States?
Well, I realize we don't play with the largest market participants, the worldwide conglomerates. Typically, they don't use our services, and I don't interact with them as much. They typically have a service where they will service themselves by dealing with risk and opportunity and balancing that out through typically a stage gate type process. And so they deal with risk and opportunity identification, vetting in a different way than the smaller participants that I'm going to describe now do. Typically, many of those companies are dealing in a firefighting mode. They are trying to get their product out the door, resolve a problem, get that manufacturing quantity high enough, a quality problem, all sorts of different things are going on. But typically they're very tactical. And that's really unfortunate because I think one of the problems with that is that the strategy of the company has chosen to focus more on the dollars spent today than the opportunity down the road. And so that's a risk assessment that they've decided it's more opportunistic to deal with today's dollars than long-term opportunity, which I think is a deal killer. But obviously, I don't agree with a lot of companies out there in saying that. So it's just interesting to me, the balancing of how we set up our employees, the flow of decisions, the flow of money to deal with risk, today's risk, and not be thinking about long-term opportunity, long-term risk, all sorts of things. So it's a very different world, and I don't typically play in that world.
That is very true, and that's what I mentioned when in the beginning, that to look at the strategic risk, strategic security risk, or to focus on strategic intelligence or competitive intelligence. A lot of corporations, they are not interested in doing that, and the data suggests that the incumbents, that is the disruptees, rarely respond effectively to disruptive innovations. And because disruption can take time, it's not like that because the idea is there today, the innovation is there today, or the technology is there today, that tomorrow the market will be completely displaced. It's a process that it has to go through, and it's a long process. So disruption takes time, and that is the reason a lot of corporations, incumbents, they overlook that, and they are not focused on that. So I mean, the best example is looking at the Netflix and how it disrupted the whole market, and how the Blockbuster completely got blinded, and they didn't focus on the strategic threat that was coming their way, because it took them a long time. The Netflix, when it launched, I remember then when we subscribed to that, we would choose a movie and it would take about a few days before it will reach us. And that did not disrupt the Blockbuster, because they were still, they didn't see that as a threat. They thought that, we have a strong customer base. We don't need to worry about this new company that has launched. But when the technology changed, and when Netflix was able to stream everything, all the movies, that, completely shook the Blockbuster, and they collapsed because they were not prepared for it. They did not think about the strategic risk that was coming their way. They did not keep an eye on the innovations, technology that were developing in the cyberspace, in the digital world, that could, put their business, completely to, stop, and the customers will move away. They did not see that coming. So that is a perfect example, if you look at it, that, they did not look at it. So if the disruption is occurring, how should incumbent companies react? How should Blockbuster have reacted? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I have two to get started. One is that there is a complacency in large companies that size is somewhat protective. Think of a fort built on the hill in the medieval Europe. Size and strength was dealt as a a way to prevent risk from coming in your walls and disrupting your area. And that is true to an extent. But once you figure out that there are ladders and things that break through the wall, obviously that's a problem. And most people in a fort, a large business, if you can take this cheesy analogy, would not think about those things to any serious degree. They would think about their safety. So the other aspect, the part B to my answer is that most companies that are making money managing their costs are very focused on those two things, and they're not thinking about their long-term opportunities, and they're not thinking about their long-term risk. And to me, the first thing to do to recognize opportunity and to recognize risk is to be aware, have feelers out such that you have competitive intelligence looking outside the walls of your business or the virtual walls of your business saying, my goodness, there's this thing called Netflix in the world, and it's not our model. However, it's pretty interesting and close to our space. We need to study it, monitor it, and decide at some point, is this an opportunity or a risk or something that will fade away and go? And so most companies that I've been around do not assess those things thinking in the long term. And I say long term in the context of at least 10 years and over. Typically, we start out with 15 years as just an uncomfortable knife in the ground, if you will, to say, let's be thinking on the long term, 15 years or more, what's going to happen to your business so that we can recognize those things that need to be monitored. And then at some point we can say that's a risk or it's an opportunity, or we can choose to ignore it. But typically many companies don't do those things. And so this deciding not to decide to look outside your walls is a little inconvenient because we're firefighting. So I think that's the first stake in the ground, is that there has to be an awareness that life extends beyond the walls of your business. And we need to be thinking about risk and opportunity identification.
Of course, absolutely. And I think we live in a time where every corporation, large or small, they need to have someone looking into all these disruptions that are happening all across nations. They need to be looking at the technologies, the ideas, innovations that are emerging from across, cyberspace, geospace, space boundaries, because this is no longer just that we are confined to just the geospace competition. We are being, facing competition from not only geospace, but cyberspace and space. The computer code and connected computers has connected everything. So we have to be looking holistically at all these integrated, cyberspace, geospace, space technologies that are coming our way. What are the risks emerging from that, and how we can protect ourselves? So the self-disruption needs to be there. Every corporation needs to focus on self-disruption. And if the perfect example is, if you remember Apple, they have given us the perfect model for self-disruption. If you remember, long time back, we all were using iPods. And iPods, because iPods was very successful, but the Apple did not stop there. They created smartphone. And when they created smartphone, the iPod market, the sales started going down, and the smartphone sales started, going up. But they did not say that, okay, one of our product is going to be completely, outdated because of, the smartphones that we are creating. They did the disruption themselves. So I think the self-disruptive strategies for the established incumbents is so very essential. And if they don't have the in-house resources, they need to get help from the outside, and get some advisors or consultants or established corporation companies that are focused only on that, to give them that kind of guidance and help and suggestion that they need to be doing self-disruptive strategies themselves if they want to survive, and if they want to have sustainability for their business in the coming years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So what do you think is the biggest obstacle to executing self-disruptive strategies for these established incumbents? Why are they not focusing on that?
Well, I think Clayton Christian really hit the nail on the head. He wrote The Innovator's Dilemma and a number of other books, of course, dealing with disruption, what it is, and how to implement it. And I think he hit the nail on the head because he described that as companies grow, they mature into a model where they become optimized. And becoming optimized looks at how to manufacture more effectively, increasing the number of widgets you're able to make out of whatever you started with, cost efficiency, people efficiency, and all these other things. So they become optimized solutions typically. Apple is an exception to that. And so in that optimization, they become so focused on producing their widget, whatever that is, that they really lose sight of thinking forward and thinking at what point will a technology, a new marketplace, or a patent or other things be introduced in their sphere that could be innovation opportunities or risk disruptors to their business. And so I think the mindset has to be shaken up, and the managers of companies have to be thinking about how do we maintain an awareness of what's going on around us. And once they establish that question in their minds and their teams and their boards, they will say, wow, we need to be thinking in a different way. We're becoming so optimized that we are losing our touch with the outside world. And just like a politician, they certainly need to mingle with their people that voted them in and their other constituents. They will be voted out of office if they lose touch with their particular consistency. So that's really important for businesses, I think.
Yes, very true. Not only businesses, if you look at governments, if you look at NGOs or academia, they all are facing the same threat. It is not just the industries that are facing the threat, because the technology that is emerging from cyberspace is giving us an ability to do things in an entirely different way. So the government, how we do voting, that is likely going to change in the coming years. How the land our ownership, the land titles and house titles, and even the academic credentials from colleges, like the transcripts and everything, it's going to be digitalized. The way we teach students, academia is going to, the model is changing. So the government, how we govern, is going to change. How the NGOs are operating, it is going to change. It is not just the businesses. I mean, right now, if you look at the businesses also within industries, only some industries you see that the change is happening very rapidly, like in financial technology or healthcare technology. Some of the industries are being disrupted much more aggressively than other industries. We haven't seen much disruption coming from energy industry or other industries, but we will be seeing that in the coming years. Every industry is being targeted by innovators, by young people who want to do things in a different way, more economical, more efficient, more customer friendly, more outcome focused. So there is a lot of there are a lot of changes happening. So when you are advising your clients, how do you advise them that how to bring new technology to this old school, old way of doing things? How would you tell them to, change their ways, to develop new models, new way of doing things and disrupt?
Wow, that's a loaded answer in that. Let me try this. Let me say that one of the things that we see is that when people come up with a new idea, they're very excited. And this plays true for a large company, large in a mid-sized context to us, and in a small innovator entrepreneur that has a great idea. Both of them will generally think there's a lot of opportunity, and they'll run as fast as they can that direction without really doing much due diligence. And so one of the things that we help them assess is that we help them say, wow, there's risk and opportunity mixed up in this pool of information that they know or we provide, whatever it is. And so one of the first things to do is to recognize what are those directions of risk that you could incur, such as the government. You mentioned the government earlier, and the tax structure could change. If you're an alternative energy and you're getting a tax subsidy, removal of that subsidy is a risk that is maybe real or not real. It may happen down in the road in the future, and there's a dollar amount associated with it. So evaluating the timeline, the amount of risk, is it reversible, are all things that have to be considered in these discussions. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that companies often identify something that they want to make or produce, virtually or non. And so one of the things that we try to do is help them identify not only the opportunities, but these tangents of risk that they're being exposed to, because typically those elements do not enter their mind. They're boring. They're much less exciting. People generally don't want to talk about them in a group setting. They want to talk about their great idea without introducing risk into that equation. And so identifying and prioritizing how much risk is being occurred for those innovations is really important. But again, the first question has to be, what elements of risk am I introducing by coming up with a new innovation? For example, one of the virtual things that we deal with all the time, literally a project just yesterday, is we had a client that's dealing with a software innovation in the marketing sense. And so in this marketing software idea they have, it turned out that Amazon has a number of patents in that area. And because Amazon has a financial fortitude and a legal team that is standing by, we know that there's three elements of risk that coalesce into a large element of risk for this particular company. And so certainly we want to be apprised of that as we move forward and try to jockey into the appropriate market position, intellectual property position, technology, and all these other elements. We want to make all those elements of risk minimized to the appropriate extent and change that into opportunity where we can.
Yes, of
So
course, of course. But as you talk to these decision makers, the clients that mid-sized companies or large corporations, what do you see as the most pressing issues that are impacting their businesses that keep them, from focusing on the strategic, security risk or the strategic intelligence, or focusing on the competitive strategic intelligence, or tactical intelligence coming their way?
I think the main one is psychological. They think that they have to stay in this firefighting mode because there's a real, if you will, tangible problem that's being experienced in production, manufacturing, quality, shipping, something that they can say something is not in this optimized system working the way it was designed and the way we've worked with it for decades, perhaps. And so they recognize that as a risk and a problem that has to be resolved. And so the part of that that helps reinforce that is that the financial engines are all focused on fixing those problems, because that revenue that's coming in they're highly dependent upon it, and they're expecting it from day to day, not necessarily year to year or decade to decade. And so the key aspect there is that the psychology of organizations is to deal with the tactical rather than the long-term opportunity risk assessments that are really needed to keep a company healthy in the long term. I think disruptive technologies for the laggards that, maybe the Netflix is coming in and disrupting a blockbuster. If you're sitting on your laurels, seeing a stream of money, you don't want to disrupt that stream of money. At the same time, you're paying off your shareholders, optimizing your processes, building more stores, all these things that are in the tactical sense very correct, but in the long-term sense, they're very open to disruption. So I
Yes.
think it's all psychology and money-driven in the short of it.
It is. It is money driven. The short-sightedness about satisfying the shareholders today, rather than thinking that while we are satisfying shareholders today, that in the coming years, as the disruption happens in our industry or in our on our businesses, the shareholders are anyway going to be not happy because the sales are going to be down because some other businesses have already taken over the disruptive technology or innovation. So whether you make the shareholders unhappy today or tomorrow, or whether you want to survive today or whether you want to be sustainable in business, those kind of questions each decision maker need to ask today. So what do you think, as you say, the psych and the mentality is very important, the culture within the organization, how they look at things, how their approach is, what their approach is. So what should each organization be thinking today from your perspective?
Well, I think to set up the company appropriately for investors and expectations, I think the main thing is mentality again. If you look at Apple, which you mentioned earlier, the investors of Apple know that Apple produces great products, both in the real sense and in the virtual sense. And the expectation is that they will continue to innovate and improve their domain well over the long term. And so in the short of it is that if they miss a quarter, people say, it's no big deal. I trust Apple to be thinking about their profits, their products, their users. They're very user-focused, of course. And so that's really good. Another example that has fewer products is if you look at Elon Musk and his web of companies, there's a high degree of hype around those companies. And essentially, I equate that hype with trust. Elon is a very personal person. He is a trustworthy conveyor of information and products, saying, we are going to go to the moon. We are going to produce an electric vehicle. We are going to tunnel underneath the city. And he flaunts it just enough to say, we are doing that, and we're going to show up all the big guys. and he's trustworthy and exciting. At the same time, he's not making a lot of money right now for all these various companies. There probably will be in the long term, but it's mostly hype at this point. And so it's a fascinating case study of like a larger entrenched player of Apple versus a newer guy, Elon Musk, who, in the sense of the businesses he's running today, generally aren't producing much profit and there's a lot of debt. So it's an interesting case study to compare the two. And certainly there are other companies worthy of a discussion out there.
Yes, of course, of course. I mean, it's interesting that you talked about Elon Musk. And so if you talk about his venture Tesla, do you think it's a disruptive model?
It probably will be disruptive. Let me do that. I'll be political for a second. And the reason I say probably is that Elon Musk's company, Tesla, if for those who don't know it already, Tesla is very disruptive. However, in the market context, they have forced a lot of the entrenched players, of course, to look at electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and all these different variations. And so they're disrupting the marketplace. However, the long-term story for me hasn't been written in that. As those entrenched players are adapting to this disruptive technology and people's expectation, consumers' expectations, they haven't shown that they're going to be profitable in the long run. So I'm kind of waiting to make sure that they are actually, in the market context, successful and profitable before I say, yes, they are a true market disruptor. It's interesting to me because all the larger companies in general, stereotyping them, were very entrenched on internal combustion engines of some sort to make their vehicles work properly. And so there's a lot of sunk cost in manufacturing and knowledge and intellectual property and on and on. And so now having to retool and buy new systems at the same time deal with these sunk costs from a financial perspective is a huge burden to bear. But as a market participant in the largest sense, the General Motors, the Fords, et cetera, they have more resources than others, but they also have a huge amount of debt as they restructure and retool. So I'm very interested to see in 10 years down the road if Elon Musk's Tesla company can be the disruptor and survive this and be the disruptive company that they have provided. I think that in the context of a disruptive technology, they have certainly introduced that wrinkle into the system, and that will be successful. I see no indication that that's going to reverse itself in the near term.
What are your thoughts on Uber? Do you consider Uber as disruptive?
Yes, I consider Uber disruptive. Unfortunately, the market participants were highly regulated. If you look at Austin, Texas, we regulated our taxi service, like most large cities, very stringently. And so the taxi drivers are operating according to government regulations, driving company direction, and what they can do, such as background checks, fingerprint checks, and all these different things to make sure that the riders are safe. And so here comes Uber and Lyft and other virtual technologies that say, we can do that better. Unfortunately, the industry entrenched players, such as the cab companies, the bus companies, are so heavily regulated that they're having a hard time adjusting because the regulations aren't keeping up with the technology, which is common. They're stagnant that way. So I think it's disruptive, to answer your question. Unfortunately, I don't think it's as disruptive as I would have liked to see because I don't think the cab companies and the regulations that are driving them have been given a fair shot to say they really won this little bout of person versus person as opposed to one person with their hands tied behind their back. So it's an interesting technology and it will be disruptive.
It is interesting, but there are many who says that while Uber is an outlier and is a great success in its own ways, it is not disruptive because they have not created new markets. So there are many who say that unless you create new markets where there were none, you are not disruptive. So there is, a debate going on among many, academicians about whether Uber is actually disruptive while they are very, very successful. And a lot of, people and a lot of, leaders call them disruptive, that they are not actually disruptive because they have not created a new market, as in the classical way that if you are having disruptive forces and you are creating new markets, then you are a disruptor. So I mean, these are the debates going on. But from your assessment, which industries are resisting the disruptive forces? I mean, just talked about that the tax industry highly regulated, and it was very difficult from them to change from within or to make it more efficient or more cost effective or more customer friendly from within. So the Uber kind of competition started taking over. Where, I mean, healthcare also we are seeing that is getting disrupted, and hope in coming years we will see digital medicine emerging so rapidly that a lot of medical doctors, medical specialties will be outdated, and they won't their business will be taken over by just smartphone or some AI based doctors. So healthcare is seeing that, financial industry is seeing that. If you look at uh, cryptocurrencies, and if you look at blockchains and many different ways of doing things in deep learning, machine learning, it is taking over a lot of major segments of the financial industry. But you see also many industries that are very resistant, that you don't see changes happening. What do you see in the market, and from your interactions with the industries?
Well, I don't know that certainly different companies have different elements of risk, such as international risk. If you're producing military weapons and selling overseas, the status quo could be disrupted very quickly as people's opinions in those countries, the politicians that are paying you the money, are changed. So if you're a Lockheed Martin and you're selling very expensive aircraft and ships and other defensive technologies, that technology can be, or those sales can be disrupted very quickly by people's perceptions overseas, not laws or anything else. And so certainly companies that are in that space have to be very concerned, because as the United States jockeys its political position, there is a huge element of risk of how those companies are perceiving us, the government in the United States. So you have to be very careful with that. Additionally to that, and related to that, is that software like Kaspersky software, we have now decided that that software could be mining our personal information and monitoring what's going on. I have no idea if it's real. Is it technically possible? Well, from my backseat observation, yes, it's technically possible. I have no idea if it's occurring, but that stream of money is shutting off extremely fast, or maybe it's completely down for many of the United States. So long story short, I think one of the biggest elements of risk, we've talked about being stagnant and depending on this cash cow of money coming in. I think the other element of risk that we have to consider is that companies aren't thinking about how fast those streams can change and what will they fall back on. So they make one or two or more products, and they're thinking, okay, these are great, we're going to focus all our attention on that. But in the strategy sense, if there is an unknown variable, literally an unknown variable that changes that cash flow, how will you react? It could be internal, it could be political, it could be a market change. So if you're a cab company and you're thinking, wow, this is going to be great for the next 100 years, I'm going to have taxi drivers paying me, 3% year on year profit. Well, that's great if it survives. However, you have to be thinking about what could disrupt it. And sometimes we just don't really know what those risks are, but we need to be thinking about technology risk, market risk, political risk, and it all varies by the type of company and where they're operating.
Of course, now we have to consider all different risk variables, and it seems that in this era of connected computers, social and mobile technology, everyone, that is individuals and entities across NGIA, are in direct communication with one another, and we are collectively, individually and collectively, shaping the coming tomorrow. Now, do you see that the consumerization of social media technology and the big data that is being collected, data's influence, is driving decisions about the coming tomorrow? And do you see that the decision makers from across all the industries have started depending or relying on the big data and analytics and the machine intelligence to drive their decisions about the coming tomorrow?
Well, certainly. If you look at companies monitoring Twitter for references to their company, looking at a statistical level, not necessarily a user level, an individual user level, companies have developed around that and made an industry to make sure that customer sentiment, the appearance of that company, such as an airline, has received a number of recent Twitter, excuse me, references that are negative. And certainly the companies want to be aware that they're being cited negatively in a social media context, because as we all know, that can go negative in a very large way very quickly. And so identification of that problem is primary interest. And the second is to have a game plan that says when that's causing a problem very quickly, we should have a game plan anticipating that we know how to deal with it. Maybe not the specific instance, but we pull in a specific consultant, we say certain things, we don't say certain things, and so we develop a game plan, maybe for some specific scenarios, but certainly for a scenario where we don't necessarily know where all the negative sentiment is coming from and how it's being perceived. So having those long-term thoughts and monitoring systems developed, I think, is a perfect indicator of how these Twitter monitoring services are working to say customer sentiment's down, what's being said about our company by the individual users. And so as you detect a problem, you can start to drill into it and say, maybe we can address that on a real level or a virtual level or some other level that maybe we haven't determined yet.
Very true, very, very true. Now, across nations, the barriers to entry in the market no longer exist just in geospace, as I mentioned earlier. It's also in cyberspace and also in space. So, a lot of space innovations are happening. A lot of space ventures that are coming, emerging, are going to impact nations' economies significantly. And these unexpected competitors are coming in from not only cyberspace, geospace, space, but also from across the sector, industries, and nations. Do you see what is the level of preparedness? Do you see, across industries or nations, from based on the interactions that you are having with your customers and clients all across nations?
Well, I think in general, we certainly encourage thinking out of the box and thinking in a competitive intelligence sense. So trying to detect those perturbances that are becoming reality down the road, or maybe becoming reality. And so in general, I think larger companies are much more adept at identifying and dealing with those problems, whatever they are. But the mid-sized to smaller companies don't even realize that those things should be thought about, especially mature companies, as they're thinking about their bottom line, their cash cows. They're not thinking about all the things that could happen from, if they're a terrestrial company, what could happen from new technologies and new markets in outer space. There's certainly a lot of privatization, a lot of opportunity coming. It hasn't been realized yet, and so people aren't necessarily thinking about their companies changing on a dime and identifying those risks and opportunities that they say, wow, we need to be thinking about a Facebook for outer space, or something that relates an existing business model on Earth to perhaps an innovation outside of Earth in a in a spatial context. And so putting those two things together with two different variables of space and time can be very difficult for smaller companies that are focused on the bottom line today to think about and deal with.
Yes, very true. Now, does your organization, or in your assessment, have you seen any disruption frameworks that are available to evaluate these new opportunities and potential threats that organizations are using? Whether you are using it for the clients or clients are using on their own. Do you see the availability of any disruption frameworks?
Well, we talk about disruptive frameworks because it's difficult to explain what we do. I typically say that when I talk with a person, typically there's a light bulb moment that happens maybe 15 minutes, maybe an hour down the road, as they understand that what they are doing in their company is different from what large worldwide conglomerates are doing. And that light bulb moment is often triggered by the fact that these large companies have competitive intelligence. They have roundtables where they're assessing innovation, risk, opportunity, strategy, all these types of things all together. And so when I'm having this light bulb moment with a person, one of the things that helps them realize that they're behind the curve is that telling them that these large companies are doing everything that we're doing to help small companies, essentially in an a la carte sense. Large companies are doing 24/7 with dedicated groups of people in all different contexts. And so at that point, they realize, wow, I'm kind of behind the curve. I'm a small company. I don't have the resources of a really large company. How am I going to deal with that problem? And so that light bulb moment, that saying that, wow, we're already behind the curve and I didn't know that curve existed until just a moment ago, is the real critical, philosophical, strategical level that says, I need to do something.
Yes, yes, we all need to do something about this disruption that is coming our way. So, what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners about your organization's effort in helping entities across NGIO, that means nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, in managing their disruptive strategy or in coming up with disruptive strategy and not being disrupted and coming up with the disruptive innovations within their own organizations, or how to acquire the disruptive innovations and technology from other organizations, startups. What would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners about your efforts towards that?
Wow, I could go a lot of different directions with that. That's great. I would say that, of course, having an open mind and a strategic mindset is important, as we described earlier. But I do think that the awareness that the disruptors to a business aren't necessarily well known. If you're General Motors, the disruptions may not come from a Ford or a Chrysler. They may come in the form of a Tesla company that's founded and started out from scratch using the technology that it's going to use, disruptive technology, by the way, that could displace your current market position as a leader. And so the technology, the patents, the legal framework, the politics, all these things are potential disruptors. But most people think both in the short term in the firefighting sense, but they don't think about competitors necessarily coming from outside their market competitors that they're familiar with. If you're a Coke, you're worried about Pepsi. If you're Snapple, you're concerned about other drink producers. But in the long story of what is competition, the technology to make tea has been around a long time. However, the market perception and the ways that those have been formulated have been adapted such that they may be infringing on Pepsi or Coke's turf. And so what was seen as a separate marketplace has now melded into theirs and perhaps disrupted it as sugary drinks have experienced a decline in public perception lately. And so those are just examples that market participants are important to keep track of. However, disruption comes in many forms, whether it be technological, political, intellectual property at times, just a number of different places. And so that realization is really important to instill in an organization.
Great. So thank you so much, Steve, for participating in Risk Roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on disruptive strategy, and our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided on not only disruptive strategy, but the changing global fundamentals and the emerging disruptive models that we see across nations, government, industries, organizations, and academia. So even if a single individual or entity can come up with an idea to understand disruptive strategy and come up with ideas to solve complex challenges facing humanity based on the understanding they received from the discussion we had today, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you, Steve, again. So it seems that in industry after industry, once formidable competitors that had built their success on apparently impenetrable strategic positions are coming under attack from relative unknowns that are employing entirely radical new strategies. So as disruptive strategy fundamentally transforms components of NGIOA, it is important that we evaluate security risk rising because of the profound implications to the future of the humanity. Risk groups, cybersecurity, geosecurity, and space security risk research centers are created for this very reason, to identify, evaluate, and manage the risk facing NGIOA in CGS. And we at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace, they walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. It is not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security, so if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, It will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the risk counters, to watch the risk counter videos or hear the risk counter podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree Pandya, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.